Hey guys, do you think that paying student athletes is going to spell the end of college sports as we know it? Now, I know that this is a politically fraught debate. I know that there are a lot of people who feel really strongly one way or another about this. And I don't really intend to cause hard feelings or to get people really angry or anything like that. I do want to look at this, though, and talk about it because I think, like many of you, I feel upset about the nature of the sport I loved to watch as a kid changing completely. It's something that's happened over the last couple of years, but especially over what feels like the last couple of weeks. And it's something that I think is a little bit difficult to deal with. So we're going to look at this right away. This comes from a Fortune.com article that was published yesterday. That would be February 24th, since I know that people tend to watch videos maybe a couple days after the fact. This is the NCAA president, Charlie Baker. We'll start here from the top. NCAA president Charlie Baker said Friday, so 2 days ago, that action by Congress was needed to protect what he described as the 95% of athletes whose ability to play college sports would be endangered by a court ruling or regulatory decision declaring them as employees of their schools. All right. So the idea here, of course, is that most student athletes would not be able to play college sports if we call them employees of the schools, right? Going on, speaking to a small group of reporters near the NCAA's Washington office, Baker was realistic, but still hopeful about the prospect of Congress doing what it didn't do, despite persistent requests from his predecessor, Mark Emmert, granting the NCAA a limited antitrust exemption that would allow it to make rules safeguarding college sports without the constant threat of litigation. So now you can see what this is really about. This is more about you should treat us the way that you treat the NFL and Major League Baseball by giving us the ability to do what we want, to not pay student athletes, and so on and so forth. This is quite concerning, and I want to go just really, really quick into what the argument is behind this, and we'll move on a little bit from there and talk about implications and what I think. So Baker in December proposed creating a new tier, Division I, that would allow the schools that make the most money from sports to pay their athletes, but he doesn't want internal NCAA reforms or a court ruling to endanger sports at the vast majority of member schools. The NCAA is facing several lawsuits and a unionization effort at Dartmouth that could result in athletes getting classified as employees. The employment model would not work at historically black colleges and universities, he said, or at Division II or III schools. Now, the point that he's making is a fairly good point. You can see here as the article continues that there's this point about, 95% of colleges spend between $5 million and $40 million in college sports and they lose money, right? I want to sort of stop this right here and let you know what I think about this argument, right? There are a couple of problems here with this argument that should be obvious to you. The first one, of course, is that there's nothing that forces colleges to have competitive college football teams. In fact, if you've been paying attention, you know that colleges have been entering the college football world, not leaving it, or they've been trying to move up to Division I instead of moving down to divisions where lesser amounts of money are being paid out. So this idea that colleges are losing tons and tons of money because they're fielding a football team is total rubbish. I don't buy that at all. That's a bad argument because if they were losing money, they would stop offering football, not offer more of it. That should be obvious. Second thing is that obviously I believe whether you think athletes should be paid or not, it's really unlikely that paying athletes is going to shut down the sport. The reason why is because athletes have always been paid, right? We've had scholarship programs at these schools. That's what has happened for decades upon decades upon decades, right? What is the difference? Well, the difference is you're giving more rights and protection to the athletes. And you have to keep in mind that the vast majority of people who play at the college level don't go on to be professional. Most of them go on to live ordinary lives doing ordinary jobs. In fact, some of them end up with long-term injuries that really harm their livelihood. And I mean, they don't get very much protection or anything to help them along, right? This is a big problem, which is something I think that you have to keep in mind. Now, whether the right thing is to pay them a salary and treat them as an employee of the school is a completely different point. But this argument that we can't give a cent of this money that we absolutely have to have for ourselves and we're losing money anyway is a complete non-starter. The third point I want to make here about this is that the practice of paying players is really old and has not ended, right? You guys all know about the death sentence for SMU in the 80s after the boosters were caught paying players like over and over and over again, right? SMU's problem is not that they were paying players, but that they got caught, right? The truth is that if you really dig into college football, it's always been like this. Hey, look, I went to BYU, right? BYU's most famous players are who? Well, Steve Young, right? Who's a descendant of Brigham Young. That one's obvious. But who's next? Jim McMahon, right? Why do you think that Jim McMahon, who had nothing to do with Mormonism, went to BYU, right? Do you think he did so out of the goodness of his heart? Do you think he did so because nobody else would let him pass, right? No. I mean, the reason why is because he got a sweetheart deal. That much is obvious, and he's not the only one, and he won't be the only one going into the future, right? You got to sort of forget this fantastic idea of the student athlete and we do it just for the love of the game or whatever. It's just not true. That's a bunch of junk. The other interesting thing about this argument is if you look backwards at the history of association football in England, this is the same argument that they used in the 50s and 60s against having games shown on television. It's going to harm attendance for smaller clubs. It's going to hurt the little guys, so we can't let that happen. Instead, the organization has to have as much power as it possibly can. And what happened in the end? In the end, the Premier League eventually was created because the largest, most rich clubs were absolutely fed up with the fact that they could not earn money from what they were doing. They could not operate as a business because of this bureaucratic intransigence. That's the problem that you're seeing today in college football. Now, having said all that, am I worried about college football as we know it ending? Yes, but for a different reason. The reason why I'm worried about this is because, as all of you know, we have the Big Ten and we have the SEC who are becoming huge. Both of these conferences have become absolutely massive over the last couple of years, and they're starting to throw their weight around, and they have major networks behind them, ESPN and CBS, right? We just swapped, right? We swapped which one controls which. The truth is that college football, I think within the next decade, is going to go down to a two-conference sport. And the reason why I think that's going to happen is because the amount of money that schools are getting from ESPN, from the other media conglomerates for being in those conferences is so large that the other schools will not be able to keep up. That's the reason why you're seeing Florida State push hard to leave the ACC. That's the reason why the ACC likely will not last through the end of the grant of rights agreement. The reason for this is because it simply can't compete. There's not enough money coming in to allow schools to compete at the highest level. That means that you don't get the best recruits and the best players coming over, and that means that the schools that are putting a lot of money into the college football machine are not getting as much back as they would like to. That's where the real problem lies, and I just simply don't see any way around it. I mean, like I said, I followed BYU football since I was a kid, right? 1990, I went to my first game with my dad. We watched BYU beat Miami. It was the number one team in the country at the time. I remember it very well, right? But I'm telling you that, the independence period for me was painful. Going to the Big 12 has been nice, but I have no illusions about BYU becoming nationally relevant because it's part of the Big 12. Joining the Big 12 for BYU is no different than the formation of the Mountain West Conference, and it's no different than being in the Western Athletic Conference was, because today the truth is that there are only two conferences that matter. So, what does all this have to do with anything? Well, first of all, don't tell me that paying student athletes will kill the sport. The sport's already dying. It has nothing to do with the NCAA president. It has nothing to do with individual schools. It has nothing to do with you and me not eating our broccoli or saying our prayers or whatever. This has everything to do with the reality of the media landscape. And that's just the way that it is. There's not anything you and I can do other than boycott the sport completely, which we probably won't do, right? So, I mean, it's going to change. It's going to change no matter what, right? And it's going to change in a way that is probably not going to be acceptable to a lot of us, with old traditional rivalries permanently broken up, and with schools in both major conferences not playing against each other until you get to the postseason. This is the reason why, when I'm looking at action PC football and what can be done, I gravitate towards total realignment and just completely changing the college football landscape, because the landscape that is emerging is ridiculous and is not something that is interesting to me. I would rather rewrite the whole script, make it regional again, and try to come up with something that's actually interesting than play around with this game and think about how nice it must be to be the head of these television companies. And might I add, the great irony behind all of this is that the major money that is pushing things comes from television, which, while it controls a lot of money, is increasingly becoming irrelevant. My children don't watch television. We don't watch college football at home because we don't have television service at home. We don't need it. And when you realize that you don't need it, you realize that the whole thing is built on a deck of cards that's about to come down. Anyway, love to know what you think. Talk to you later. Bye.